You know those stories you hear and think they're exaggerated? What if I told you there was once a place in London where men and women were tortured until they lost everything that made them human, and all with society's blessing? If you can endure until the end, you'll understand why even today, they say Holloway isn't an abandoned asylum. It's a prison for souls, and one of them still knocks at the door, searching for something it should have never lost. My name is Jonathan Hale. I am 64 years old, and I carry a burden that few would have the courage to hear to the end. My grandfather, Elias Hale, heard this story firsthand from Margaret Hale, our distant relative. She survived what happened at Holloway Asylum in 1825. She saw it with her own eyes and lived to tell about it. Margaret was young when she was accepted as a nurse at Holloway. At that time, being a woman and securing employment outside kitchens or brothels was almost an act of war against society. She accepted what seemed like a chance to change her destiny, without knowing she was stepping through the gates of a hell far colder than death itself. And I'm here to tell you what they were hiding inside. But first, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because there's a new story like this every week, and you won't want to miss it. Now, get ready. Holloway Asylum wasn't feared by the city. Not officially. Families who deposited their inconveniences there, rebellious women, melancholic men, deformed children, never asked about them again. It was convenient, and the city chose to look the other way. The building emerged from the fog like a sleeping monster, built from heavy, dark stones, as if its very weight wanted to drag it into the earth's depths. Tall, narrow windows like starving slits, twisted iron gates that groaned at the slightest wind, and the silence, that heavy, loaded silence, as if the very walls were on the verge of whispering. Inside, it was even worse. The cold didn't come just from winter. It seeped from the stones, from the bones, from the ground itself. It pierced the skin, embedded itself in the lungs. And the smell, old urine, dried blood, mold, and something else, something sweetly putrid like forgotten meat. The sound of Margaret's boots echoed on the stone floor, and along with it came whispers, moans, broken prayers. The cells, if one dared to call them that, were stone pits with rotten wooden doors. Inside them, forgotten human beings. Some naked, their bodies blackened with cold and filth. Others wrapped in rags, clinging to themselves as if trying to keep their souls from escaping. Some banging their heads slowly, methodically against the walls. Others tearing clumps of hair from their own scalps, in silence. Margaret saw children, boys with eyes so glazed they already seemed dead. Women with scratched faces, nails bitten down to the bone. Men speaking in tongues that had never existed. And they all had one thing in common. They had been thrown there not for being insane, but for being inconvenient. Back then, insane could mean young women who refused to marry, elderly men with slow, dragging speech, women who read novels, children born with any kind of deformity. Anything was enough to condemn a person to oblivion. The doctors at Holloway were men of great renown in London, respected, applauded by the scientific community. But inside those walls, they were more executioners than healers. They performed bloodletting without restraint until the inmates collapsed, supposedly to expel bad humors. They plunged women into freezing baths for hours to calm hysterical nerves. They forced shocks to the scalp, claiming to rekindle reason. They drilled into skulls to release internal demons. And when none of it cured the patient, they administered forced purgings, inducing vomiting and diarrhea until the person was too weak to scream. And then there was the worst of all, the experiments. Some inmates, especially those without family or name, were selected for special procedures. Injections of experimental substances, exposure to deadly viruses just to see if the body would resist, surgeries without anesthesia, cutting out parts of the brain deemed infected, tests to reverse madness by plunging victims into absolute terror. Margaret heard it all, saw it all. She was forced to witness therapy sessions where inmates were burned with hot irons to purify impure thoughts, where pregnant women were beaten until they lost their children, because a bastard child was considered a sign of possession. And then came the foreign doctor, an elegant man with a foreign accent, who arrived at Holloway with a new project, a special experiment. Margaret was summoned, without the right to refuse, to assist in a procedure no one dared to speak of openly. An experiment involving a woman named Eliza, a young patient who had lost her mind after watching her baby starve to death in the cell where she had been imprisoned. Margaret didn't yet know, that first week, the horrors she would be forced to witness. But she could feel it. She felt it in the walls. She felt it in the wind that whistled through the corridors. She felt it in the hollow eyes of the inmates who, even in their ruined states, seemed to know. Holloway Asylum was not a place for healing. It was a place to forget that suffering had a face. And Margaret, without realizing it, was already trapped in that labyrinth where even screams were swallowed by stone. Margaret Hale could never have imagined that anything could be so grotesque. During her first days at Holloway, she still tried to process everything she saw. She tried to find meaning in the scenes of horror and the brutality disguised as medicine. But she knew that, as a woman, and even more so as a nurse, she could not question. Questioning was dangerous. A misplaced word, a glance of disapproval, and she could easily find herself thrown into one of those cells. Or worse, into the Hall of the Forgotten. So Margaret stayed silent. She swallowed her fear dry, and did as she was told. It was while changing the putrid bandages of an inmate named Agnes that she first heard the rumors. Agnes was little more than a skeleton covered in skin. Her ribs jutted sharply beneath her necrotized flesh, and one of her legs already exhaled the sweet, sickening smell of gangrene. Her eyes, hollow and vacant, blinked from time to time, as if some fragment of consciousness still desperately clung to life. The wound Margaret tended on the side of her head never healed, an open crater, infested with flies, pulsing with a grayish, viscous ooze. The soft touch of the gauze drew a rough, broken moan from Agnes, like the bleating of a dying animal. It was then that an older nurse, Mrs. Bartlett, approached silently, her expression as rigid as stone. She whispered, barely moving her lips, "If you hear 3 knocks tonight, close your eyes, and pray, girl." Margaret pretended not to understand, but the old Bartlett continued, as if moved by a force she could no longer resist. "The Hall of Reflections." She spat the name like venom. "Some doors must remain closed. There are souls that forget to die, Margaret, and there are pains that forget to end." She drifted away as silently as she had come, and Margaret, her skin crawling, felt the walls of the ward tighten around her, as if Holloway itself was listening, breathing, waiting. On the 3rd night, it happened. While cleaning up the vomit of a patient who had collapsed in a seizure, she heard it. The knocking. 3 dry knocks. A slow rhythm. And something else. Something wet, sticky. The knocks came from beyond the main ward, from the heavy, rusted iron door that led down to the Hall of Reflections. Margaret froze. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Instinctively, the other nurses and doctors lowered their heads, like actors who had rehearsed the choreography of denial. No one looked at the door. No one spoke of what knocked, as if acknowledging it would be an invitation. And for a moment, just a moment, Margaret thought she heard something else, mixed in with the knocks, a cry. Low, ragged, from a woman. "Give me back my baby." She blinked, and the sound was gone, as if it had never existed. But the weight of Holloway was now tangible in the air, so heavy it seemed to clog her lungs. And Margaret knew, she was no longer just caring for the mad. She was walking among echoes of suffering that refused to die. The following afternoon, Margaret was summoned. She would need to descend into the Hall of the Forgotten to apply an antiseptic ointment to one of the inmates. Most doctors refused to go down there. They said the filth could corrupt even the strongest soul. Margaret hesitated, but refusals were not tolerated at Holloway. She crossed the narrow hallway, her lantern trembling in her hand. The cold seemed to worsen with every step downward, as if she was not merely descending toward the earth, but toward something far deeper, the realm of the abandoned. The door to the hall groaned as she pushed it open, and Margaret stepped inside. The first thing that hit her was the smell: urine, feces, pus, rotting flesh, and something even more bitter, something that smelled like distilled hatred. The hall was a vast vaulted chamber, dimly lit by a few dying lanterns. Across the damp stone floor were scattered bodies, dozens of them. Some moaned, others simply twitched involuntarily, and some were completely still, eyes wide open, vacant, fixed on the stained ceiling, but still breathing. Margaret saw a woman, or what was left of one, dragging herself on her belly, leaving a trail of blood and filth behind her. Her face, half devoured by infection, smiled at the void, muttering lullabies that made no sense. She saw a naked man sitting in a corner, rubbing his face against the wall until strips of skin came off. She saw children, living skeletons, playing with dead rats. And the sound was a constant whisper, as if the ground itself were weeping. Here, madness was no longer hysteria. It was apathy, the mind broken down to nothingness. the spirit crushed until only breathing flesh remained. Margaret, her hands trembling, applied the ointment to a boy whose arm was slowly rotting from gangrene. He did not react, did not even blink. And then, as she rose to leave, she heard it again. 3 knocks. Far away. Very far. But real. Alive. All the inmates, all of them, shrank back. Shrank like terrified dogs before an invisible whip. And out of the corner of her eye, Margaret saw, in the deepest shadow of the hall, between 2 unmoving bodies, a figure, a woman, lay sprawled, her arms open, her hair spread out like dead seaweed. And her lips moved, whispering for no one to hear. "Give me back my baby." After her first descent into the Hall of the Forgotten, Margaret Hale was never the same. The stench of rot, the damp cold that soaked into her bones, the body sprawled like discarded rags, all of it seeped into her. Something inside her soul cracked, and she knew she had to leave that place, at any cost. But at Holloway, nothing was simple, and escaping, for a woman alone, with no family name or fortune, was almost impossible. So Margaret decided to wait for an opening, for a chance. In the meantime, she pretended at normalcy. She carried on with her duties, dealing with the grotesque daily routine that, for the other staff, seemed as banal as changing clothes. The doctors and nurses of Holloway had changed. Most had anesthetized themselves. They had learned to laugh during dinners, to wager on how many days a patient would survive in the hall, to speak of the inmates as if they were cattle meant for slaughter. Others, even more dangerous, genuinely believed they were doing good. They spoke of purifying society, mercy through forgetfulness, healing the world, one lost soul at a time. Margaret saw their faces reflected in the darkened windows, cold smiles, eyes shining with a zeal that was worse than cruelty. It was triumphant ignorance. Here, human life was worth less than the mud accumulating between the cracks and the stones. One sweltering morning, Margaret was sent to organize the asylum's pharmacy. A small, cramped space, cluttered with dusty vials and yellowed papers, it felt strangely safe. Away from the screams, the cries, the maddened whispers, she allowed her mind to wander. She remembered her childhood, the firm grip of her mother's hand while crossing the street, the smell of fresh bread in the oven, the sound of sincere laughter, something that now seemed to belong to another world. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to believe she might endure, that she could simply close her eyes to the monstrosities, that somehow she might pass unnoticed through it all. For a moment, she almost believed, until reality yanked her back with brutal force. That very afternoon, Margaret was summoned to Dr. Rutledge's office. The office was stifling, saturated with the smell of old leather, pipe smoke, and mildewed paper. The walls were lined with anatomy books, grotesque medical illustrations, and human skulls displayed like trophies. There, Margaret found 2 men, Dr. Rutledge, the stone-faced director of Holloway, and Dr. Otto Weiss, a new face at the asylum, a man from Prussia. Dr. Weiss was tall, gaunt, with angular features sharp as a blade. His eyes were so pale they seemed nearly colorless, and there was something in the way he observed his surroundings, methodical, clinical, cold, that made Margaret's stomach churn. "Nurse Hale," said Rutledge, his voice dry and calculated. "Dr. Weiss will be conducting a pioneering experiment in the treatment of female mental disorders." Margaret kept her gaze lowered, as protocol demanded, but she felt her heart hammering in her chest. "We have chosen you to assist him," Rutledge continued. "Your discretion and composure are qualities we value," Weiss added, speaking impeccable English, though with a slight dragging of syllables that betrayed his foreign accent. "The procedure will take place tonight, in the laboratories beneath the asylum. Come prepared. And remember, silence is the virtue of the wise." Margaret nodded, her body rigid. She did not dare to ask questions. She did not dare to show fear. She did not dare to show humanity. But inside, fear roiled like a caged beast. Back in her room, Margaret prepared her apron and gloves, as instructed. The clock ticked each minute away with a dry, relentless beat. Time marched forward like a funeral procession. And for the first time, Margaret asked herself, how many had entered that underground wing and never returned? How many eyes had gone dark without resistance, without witnesses, without even a single lament to remember them? At Holloway, humanity was stripped away piece by piece. First dignity, then identity, then the body, and finally the soul. That was how they operated. That was how they turned men and women into lumps of breathing meat. That was how Holloway fed itself. And tonight, Margaret would be part of the machinery, not as a victim, but as a witness, and perhaps as an accomplice. At 10 o'clock that night, Margaret descended into the basement of Holloway. Each step seemed to echo inside her chest. The corridor leading to the laboratory was narrow, crooked, like a stone throat ready to swallow anyone daring enough to enter. The ceiling sagged. The walls sweated a thick, sticky dampness. The smell was unbearable, blood and rotting tissue, vomit, and most of all, the stench of fear. Margaret forced her legs to move forward. She knew that once inside, there would be no innocence left. She pushed open the iron door. The creak was like a scratched scream. The laboratory looked less like a place of science, and more like the altar of a depraved cult. Tables draped with stained sheets beneath which human forms seemed to lurk. Jars containing eyes preserved in murky liquid. Scattered instruments. Blunted scalpels, twisted forceps, rust-stained pliers. Anatomical diagrams hanging from the walls. Illustrations of brains split open like rotten fruit. In the center of the room, under the dim glow of a single oil lamp, stood a bed of iron. And on it, Eliza. Before approaching, Margaret was instructed to fetch the patient's file. She flipped through it quickly, and her stomach twisted. Eliza Withmore, 19 years old. Reason for institutionalization. Improper behavior for a lady. Pregnancy out of wedlock. Family's note. She must be corrected or forgotten. She has disgraced the Withmore name. Margaret felt the file slip from her fingers. It wasn't illness. It wasn't madness. It was social shame. A condemnation without a crime. Eliza had been sent there to be erased, and now she would be worse than forgotten. She would be profaned. At Holloway, shortly after her arrival, Eliza had lost her baby. Alone, without assistance, on the cold stone floor. And instead of pity, the doctors saw an opportunity to test a new experiment to erase extreme trauma, to destroy memories without destroying the body. She was no longer a person. She was a shattered vessel for experimentation. When Margaret approached the bed, the impact was brutal. Eliza was a vision pulled straight from a nightmare. Her skin, translucent, clung tightly to her bones. Her huge, hollow eyes rolled about in erratic, unfocused movements. Her lips were cracked and dry, splitting into fine, bleeding fissures. Her swollen belly still carried the corpse of her child, now a prison inside her own body. The stench emanating from Eliza was acrid, sour, sickeningly sweet, the smell of death fermenting inside a living husk. Her hands trembled in disjointed spasms. Her head moved in small, ceaseless circles, murmuring a song with no beginning and no end. Her ankles were bound with leather straps. Her wrists, raw and scraped from failed escape attempts, now hung limply. Eliza was a corpse that still breathed, and each shallow breath was an insult to life. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but she remained standing. She had to. Dr. Weiss was organizing his instruments beside the bed. His hands moved with an almost artistic precision, sorting syringes, arranging glass vials, laying out thin metal tubes. When he turned toward Margaret, his face was a mask of absolute calm. "Nurse Hale," he said in his glacial tone, "tonight you will witness a revolution in the field of psychiatry." Margaret did not answer. "This woman," he continued, stroking Eliza's dirty hair, "carries deep pain. The loss of her child destroyed her mind. She now lives imprisoned between death and delirium." Margaret clenched her gloved hands until her knuckles ached. "Our special compound will free her. We will sever the bond between her mind and her suffering. She will forget. She will be cleansed." Margaret, with a voice barely audible, dared to ask, "And what is the true purpose of this experiment?" Weiss smiled, a cold, clinical smile. "The Kingdom of Prussia," he replied, wiping a syringe with a cloth, "needs strong soldiers. Men who will not falter before pain. Men who will not go mad in the face of war's horrors." He approached, holding a small vial containing a greenish-gray liquid. Inside it, small particles floated slowly like tiny larvae. "If we can erase trauma," said Weiss, his eyes gleaming with excitement, "we can create the perfect soldier. Without remorse, without memory, without a soul." Margaret felt bile rise to her throat. Eliza was not the first, and she would not be the last. They were merely testing the weapon they would later unleash upon thousands. And there, in that miserable laboratory, Margaret found herself standing before an impossible choice. Watch. Become an accomplice. Survive. Or fight. And vanish like so many before her. Eliza continued murmuring, lost in her own shattered mind. "My baby. My baby. Dr. Weiss prepared the syringe, filling it with the thick liquid. Margaret looked at Eliza's devastated face, and for the first time, she truly understood. Holloway Asylum was not a hospital. It was an altar of sacrifice, and tonight blood would be offered. Dr. Weiss approached the iron bed. In his hands, the syringe filled with greenish-gray liquid gleamed under the lab's dim light. Each drop seemed alive, pulsing with a hatred that felt unnatural. Margaret stood frozen. Her heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo off the walls. Dr. Rutledge observed from the shadows, like a judge at an execution. Eliza, bound to the bed, murmured into the void, "My baby, my baby." Her hollow eyes didn't seem to see anything, but her soul, even torn apart, still clung to the only thing she had left, her pain. And that was exactly what they sought to destroy. Weiss tilted his head toward Margaret. "Hold her." Margaret hesitated for just a moment, long enough to realize she was crossing an invisible line, beyond which there would be no absolution. She stepped forward and held Eliza's head between her hands. The girl's skin was cold, clammy, the touch of imminent death. Eliza shuddered at the contact. A low groan escaped from her dry throat. It was then that Weiss plunged the syringe into the vein in her neck. The thick liquid entered her body with cruel slowness. The effect was immediate. Eliza's body arched violently, as if struck by an electric jolt. The chains on her restraints stretched taut. Her eyes widened so much they seemed ready to pop from their sockets. A thick foam, yellowish and tinged with red, began to pour from her mouth. The moan turned into a deep, animalistic sound that no longer seemed human. Margaret recoiled instinctively. The stench of the compound mixed with Eliza's sweat and bile was overwhelming, a smell that would cling to her clothes and her memory for the rest of her life. Dr. Weiss watched, fascinated. "Perfect," he murmured, like an artist admiring his masterpiece. Eliza began to convulse. Her muscles spasmed uncontrollably, and her swollen belly twisted as if something inside still fought to escape. Her skin began to change color, from a corpse-pale white to a horrific purplish hue, as if being consumed from within. The young woman's flesh seemed to rebel against her own blood. From her cracked lips, incoherent words spilled out. "Mother, it hurts. No, why?" Each word felt like a punch to Margaret's soul, and yet no one intervened. No one showed compassion. The procedure had to continue until the end. Weiss scribbled notes furiously, narrating the reactions aloud. Extreme muscular tremors, ocular dilation, partial respiratory failure, persistent emotional instability, auditory delusions. Margaret could no longer hear clearly. A buzzing filled her ears, muffling everything. The horror was so immense that her mind began to detach from her body, as if observing it all from outside herself. And then came the final moment. With a burst of superhuman strength, Eliza broke free of one of her wrist restraints. Her free hand slapped her chest, her face, her mouth, as if trying to rip something out from inside herself. Her screams were no longer human. They were howls, pleading cries to a god that would never answer. And then, in one final violent spasm, Eliza's body arched backward and collapsed, heavy, motionless. A silence so profound followed that it seemed to consume the very air. Margaret stood frozen. Eliza's eyes remained wide open. But now, there was no one left inside. The body still breathed. But the soul had been torn away. The experiment was technically a success, and Margaret felt bile rise to her throat. Weiss approached the animated corpse. He gently passed his fingers over Eliza's wide, lifeless eyes, closing them slowly, like finishing a sculpture. "Clean," he whispered, satisfied. Margaret knew exactly what he meant. Eliza had forgotten, but at the cost of everything that had made her human. And deep in the laboratory, in the cold that seeped through the stone walls, something new had been born. Not a life, but an echo, a summons, the lament of a young mother without memory, without her child, without a soul. A lament that, from that night onward, would never leave Holloway. After the procedure, Eliza's body remained motionless on the iron bed. She was breathing. Her chest rose and fell slowly, like the worn bellows of an ancient organ. But her eyes, once filled with unspeakable despair, were now empty. Dead. Eliza Whitmore was alive, but she no longer existed. Dr. Weiss appeared pleased. He meticulously recorded notes in his leather-bound notebook. Margaret, however, stood frozen beside the bed, a silent witness to a crime that no medical book would ever record. "Excellent neurological response," Weiss murmured, feeling the young woman's slow, weak pulse. Margaret clenched her fists under her apron. She felt dirty. She felt complicit, and it seemed Holloway shared her nausea. The walls were sweating more than ever. The air was thick, saturated with a kind of energy Margaret couldn't name, but that made her want to retch. Something had broken that night, something that could never be repaired. But Weiss wasn't satisfied with merely seeing the body breathe. He needed proof that Eliza's mind had been completely subdued. With methodical movements, he walked over to a trunk covered by a darkened cloth. Margaret felt her mouth go dry. She knew what was inside. Weiss pulled away the cloth, revealing a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in filthy rags, lay what remained of Eliza's baby, a tiny, blackened body, bloated with decay, exuding a stench so overpowering the room seemed to shudder. Margaret covered her mouth with her hands, fighting the urge to vomit. Without a hint of humanity, Weiss removed the tiny corpse from the rags and placed it on a metal tray beside the bed. "If the rupture is complete," he said, his voice cold and neutral, "she will obey without hesitation, and show no emotion." He leaned close to Eliza's ear, and with the gentle tone one might use to command a dog, he whispered, "Eat your child, Eliza." Margaret felt the room spin around her. Eliza remained still for a moment. Then, with slow, almost mechanical movements, she lifted her torso. Her thin hands grasped the tiny corpse. Without emotion, without hesitation, without a soul, the young woman brought the body to her mouth and bit. The sound of teeth breaking through hardened flesh echoed through the room like a crack of thunder. Dried blood trickled in dark lines down her chin. Margaret turned her head away, unable to watch. Weiss, however, observed intently, noting every detail. "Total success," he murmured. "Trauma erased. Emotional resistance eradicated. The body responds without moral filters." Eliza had been stripped of every last trace of humanity. Nothing remained. Only an obedient shell. A dead echo walking. In the days that followed, Eliza was paraded as proof of the success of the new method. Strapped to a wheelchair, she was wheeled through medical inspections like a flesh-and-bone doll. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She didn't react to pain or touch. She didn't ask for food. She didn't recognize anyone. She was just a breathing, empty body. Margaret watched helplessly as the doctors boasted. "Look at her. Trauma erased. Pain eliminated. A perfect patient." Some applauded. Others discussed how to replicate the process on a massive scale for the Prussian armies. No one ever questioned what had happened to the girl's soul, because to them, the soul had never mattered. And at Holloway, what no longer served was discarded. 5 days after the experiment, Margaret received the order. Eliza was to be transferred, not for treatment, not for rehabilitation, to the Hall of the Forgotten, the cell block for those no longer useful, those who, though they still breathed, had no place left among the living. Margaret accompanied the transfer. 2 nurses shoved the wheelchair roughly, indifferent. Eliza did not react. Her eyes remained half open, glassy, reflecting the yellowish light of the corridor. When they reached the underground hall, Margaret's heart clenched. The same stench of urine, blood, and decomposition hit her. The same whispered lament vibrated through the stones. There, among crawling bodies, among forgotten groans of pain, Eliza was left. No bed, no blanket, no name. A young woman who had once dreamed of a future, now just another abandoned shadow. Margaret stood at the threshold for several minutes. She watched as Eliza's body was swallowed by the darkness, as if she had never existed. And then Margaret walked away. But Holloway would not let her forget. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. The lanterns in the corridor flickered without wind. The floor creaked though no footsteps passed. And far away she heard it, not knocking, not moaning, but a cry, a lament, a plea, faint, broken, lost. "My baby." And then, in the frozen silence, a new sound emerged. 3 knocks. Soft, scratching, begging to be let in. Margaret wept silently, curled up in her bed. She knew. Eliza had never truly left. The flesh had died. But what remained, the despair, the torn love, the hunger for justice, now wandered the bowels of Holloway, searching, calling, knocking at doors that would never open. In the days that followed, Holloway Asylum seemed to change. Or perhaps it was Margaret who had changed. The walls creaked louder. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if one had to swim through it just to move down the corridors. The lanterns threw strange shadows, shadows that shifted even when no one passed. And the crying, that faint, torn cry echoed through the cold nights, mingling with muffled knocks against the doors. My baby. 3 knocks. Always 3 knocks. Always coming from where Eliza had been abandoned. Margaret could no longer pretend. Her pale face, her sunken eyes, her trembling hands. It was obvious she was being consumed from within. But at Holloway, weakness was ignored, or exploited. The other staff went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Some bet on how many more days Eliza would last in the hall. Others laughed at the new inmates, mocking their pleas for mercy. And there were still those who defended Holloway with almost religious fervor, claiming it saved society by isolating corrupted souls. The banality of evil spread like a plague. Margaret saw it in her colleagues' faces, faces without guilt, without doubt, without humanity, and she knew that if she stayed much longer, she would become like them. Or worse, dead inside, forgotten in some dark corner, knocking on doors no one would ever answer. She had to escape, and soon. One morning, while changing the bandages of a nearly blind inmate, Margaret decided. By the end of that week, during the shift change, she would disappear. She would take only what she could carry. She would vanish into the alleys of London, where at least her soul might still belong to her. The decision, however, brought no relief, only a heavier weight, because Margaret knew that, in a way, it was already too late. Holloway had touched her, stained her, marked her, and part of her, the part that once dreamed, laughed, loved, had already been left behind in that cold sublevel with Eliza. On the night before her escape, Margaret gathered her few belongings. As she closed her small suitcase, she heard it again. 3 knocks. This time, right at her door. Stronger. More desperate. Margaret didn't move. She didn't breathe. She didn't cry. She knew it wasn't someone alive on the other side. She knew that if she opened the door, she would not see a human face. She would see what was left of Eliza, what was left of herself. And then, from the other side of the door, a cracked voice whispered, "You saw. You know. Don't leave me here." Margaret closed her eyes, and she swore to herself and to whatever might still be listening that night, "I will carry your story. I will carry your pain. I will not forget you." Margaret fled that very night. She crossed Holloway's rusted gates unseen. She disappeared into the mist of London, just another wandering soul. And she never returned. She carried the weight of what she had seen to the end of her life. She never again spoke openly of what had happened, but she whispered it, on silent nights, to those willing to listen. She told her grandnephew, the grandfather of Jonathan Hale, and he in turn passed it on to me. And now I am telling it to you, because some stories cannot be buried, because some echoes never fall silent, and because even today, if you find yourself near the ruins of Holloway, and you hear 3 faint knocks on a door, do not open it. Never open it. Margaret Hale never forgot, not even after fleeing Holloway, not even after trying to rebuild her life in the shadows of grey London. She carried the burden of what she had seen, and what she had done, until her final days. She never worked as a nurse again. She never crossed the threshold of another medical institution. She never allowed herself to be locked behind walls she couldn't tear down with her own hands. She lived discreetly, moving between humble jobs, always wary, always alert. And though her body aged, though her hair turned white, her eyes never stopped reflecting Holloway. That shadow, that mark, it was too deep to ever be erased by time. It was when she was already old and frail, sitting by a crackling fire, that Margaret finally told her story. Not to many, only to one, the young Elias Hale, her grandnephew, the grandfather of Jonathan Hale. That silent night, beneath the crackle of burning wood, Margaret spoke. Not as someone telling a legend, not as someone spinning a tale to frighten children, but as someone freeing a secret that had bled inside her for decades. And Elias listened. He listened to every word, about the stench of the damp stones, about the bodies abandoned in the hall, about Eliza, about the weeping that never ceased, about the knocks, the 3 knocks that still echoed on nights when the wind blew in from the east. And above all, about the most brutal truth of all, the real monster was never Holloway. The real monster was always man. Margaret died not long after that conversation. She passed away peacefully, knowing that, somehow, someone would carry on Eliza's story, with the hope that someday, those inhumane experiments would end. Eventually, Holloway Asylum was shut down. Its ruins remained for decades, abandoned, ignored, covered in moss and half-whispered tales. Today, They say it's nothing more than a heap of crumbling stones. But those who listen carefully, those who dare to approach on the coldest nights, sometimes still hear it. A faint cry. A desperate plea. 3 slow knocks. Soft, like thin fingers scratching at rotten wood. Begging to be let in. Begging to be remembered. And if someday you hear it, remember what Margaret taught me. Some doors were meant to stay closed. Because not all pain can be healed. And not every soul wants to be found. That was today's story. If you made it this far, let me know what you thought in the comments. Also, tell me if you've ever heard of anything similar happening near where you live. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more chilling stories coming your way. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.